Hello viewers, welcome to QTP functional testing videos. Myself Uday. In my previous video, I explained you about how as a humans we identify any specific object in the application under test because QTP follows the same kind of approach in order to identify any specific object, right? In the current video, I will explain you the same concept using flight reservation application, how exactly QTP identifies the object, okay? And how when we execute the script how exactly it is able to identify that object, where exactly we need to configure this object properties, and general guidelines or points that we need to remember in order to work with object identification. Okay, so before we proceed further, I would like to emphasize one point here. The main purpose of any automation or any automation tool is to provide the regression capabilities. So when I say regression, what we will do is we will script it once and run as many times as we want. It can be a weekly basis, it can be a daily basis, or it can be a monthly basis, or it can be a release base, right? So what exactly we are doing here is, rather than doing these operations manually in application, we are giving our intelligence to the tool such a way that it will perform the same operations on the same objects, right? So what I'm trying to say here is, uh, the automation tool is able to identify the objects exactly in the same way as humans, right? So we can remember these objects and whatever for example, if you show an apple to if I show you an apple, you can tell that an apple, right? So you store the characteristics of that apple in your mind. When I ask you what object it is, you will reply with it as saying as an apple, right? In the same way, we need to teach this QTP such a way that whenever you perform an operation, you need to teach that object of some type, and based on the properties you need to tell them the exact object name, and it stores that learner description in its memory called object repository. Okay, whenever you ask or whenever you perform an operation in your automation, what it will do is whatever the learner description it use, right, it uses that as that description to identify the object in application and perform the operation. Okay, let's go ahead. I will demonstrate you with flight reservation application. Okay, just before regarding it, uh, I would like to bring one point here, like for example, so whenever you are recording an operation in the application, right, what QTP first do is it will identify what class of what is the class associated with that object, right? The class can be, for example, it is a button, then it will the class can be win button. If it is a web control, then it can be a web button, right? Whether the object is a link or a list box or a button or a radio button, right? So when you perform an operation, it first identifies the class of that object. Okay, for each and every object class there are number of properties that can be configured. Okay, so what I'm trying to say here is where exactly we need to configure these properties in order to identify an object, right? For that you just need to go to tools menu and go to object identification, right? So for example, if you open this flight reservation, as you can see this is a standard Windows application. Okay, so in object identification, right, whatever the external add-ins or the add-ins installed, corresponding environment types getting displayed here. Okay, you need to choose the environment type here. All the objects which comes under that environment are displayed here. For example, see, for standard Windows, these are the different controls, right? Win tab, win radio button, win edit, whatever it is, win list box. Okay. So what I am trying to say here is, first, when it will look for the class of that object. Okay, for the class there are so many number of properties that we can configure. Rather than learning all these properties in order to identify object, we can categorize into two types of properties. One is called mandatory properties and another one is associative properties. So in blind terms, what I can say here is like, when it learns an object, right? For example, win button, what it will do is, it will just create a dummy object like this object. First it will learn the class, right? So class is say win button. Okay. And what are the mandatory and assistive properties? Mandatory properties are something, whatever the properties, for example, here we have two properties, right? You can configure whatever you want. Okay, whatever the properties you configure here, by default QTP learns all these properties and add these properties into the description, right? So what I'm trying to say here is, it will add all these properties, say native class equal to button, okay, like text equal to say some okay, okay, hwind equal to say some number, okay. So with this much of learned description, it will try to identify the object. If it tries to find the object uniquely, okay, then it uses description this object description during runtime. Okay, if it is not able to identify with this description, what it will do is, it will dependent on assistive properties. So for example, say if we configure these properties like native class, I think we already have the window title or something like this. Okay, if the configuration is like this, what it will do is, it will add these associative properties one by one to the learner description. So what I am trying to say here is, if it not able to identify with these properties, then it will add these associative properties one by one. Okay, so what it will do is, it will add window id equal to say some value. If it tries, if it finds the object with, mean to say, if it finds the object uniquely with this description, then the process will be stopped there itself. If it is not able to identify uniquely, then what it will do is, then it will add the next property. Okay, the main difference here is, for mandatory properties it always learns whatever the properties it configured here. If it is not able to identify with this mandatory properties, here 3, 5 or whatever it is, then it will add associative properties one by one to the learner description, right? So it will add focused, it can be yes or no. Okay, so with this description it will try to find the object uniquely. If it not able to find with this property also, then it will go for next properties, regular expression wnd title. Here also, if it is able to identify the object uniquely, then the process will stop with this learner description. Okay, if it is not able to identify, then it will dependent on either smart identification or the ordinal identifiers. Okay, so at this point of juncture, it will go to ordinal identifiers. Okay, I am not touching anything about smart identification here. I will touch this smart identification concept in my next video. Okay, so what are these ordinal identifiers? Ordinal identifiers is also having these two properties, index property and location properties. So what is the index property? For example, say I have three OK buttons here. Okay, all of these buttons having the same properties. OK, OK, OK here. Here also it is having a text with OK, and here is also text with OK. Okay, then in it no way it can able to identify uniquely with all these properties. Okay, if that is the case, then what it will do is it will use these two properties, index property or location property. So what is an index is nothing but it will assign a unique identifier. For this OK button it will add as a index as 1. For this OK button it will add index as 2. And for this OK button it will add index as 3. Okay, in that way it will add indexes for these objects. Okay, or else there is another property called location. See here, this OK button is in one location, and this OK button is in another location, and this OK button is in another location. Not all these three objects overlap one another, right? So these objects are placed in different locations, so I can use location property. Okay, so let me record session and we'll show how exactly it learned and where exactly it stored this learning description. Okay, so I'm just clicking on login button. After that I'm entering the username as Udaya name. Okay, Mercury. I'm just clicking on OK button. Okay, after that flight reservation is open. I'm just stopping this recording. Okay, so just deleting this line. It's not needed. Okay, so let's see how exactly it uses just this object identification. Okay, so just click on object identification is stored in tools and object identification. So when I'm just opening it, this is a standard Windows application, so it goes to this dialog box. Okay, so what it learns, or see where exactly these objects are getting stored. This is the place, this is an object repository, is the place where it stores all learned objects. Okay, did you guys see this? Whatever the properties we configured here, standard Windows, see it uses the same kind of process. For this login it uses all the mandatory properties first. Did you guys see? Text property is there, native property is there, is one window is there, each child window is there, right? Even if these two properties are not needed, because we configured these properties in mandatory properties, it will learn those properties. Okay, with this learner description it will store this object in its memory, right? In the same way, okay, this is the OK button is, one second, OK button is of type win button. Okay, so if you go to tools and objects, standard Windows win button, did you guys see, which uses text and native class. With these two properties it was able to identify the object uniquely. If it's not able to identify with these two properties, then it would have added window ID, right? Like that it will learn that object description and stores in a object repository. So whatever the object that it learns during recording, right, these objects are called test objects, because this object is created by QTP and stored with QTP. So these are called test objects, whereas the objects that are getting displayed here is called runtime objects. Okay, so let's get into the slides. I'm covering most of these points here. So QTP first identifies the class of an object when it learns an object where the class name can be web edit, village, link, whatever it is. Okay. For each and every object class there are multiple properties. We don't use all these properties for object identification. Rather, we categorize these properties into two types called mandatory properties and assistive properties. Okay, we can configure whatever the properties we want for mandatory and assistive. Okay, so you can choose. It need not be necessarily that you choose some of these. Always use test in mandatory, not in associate. It's not like that. So whatever properties you wish to here, include it in here. Okay, I can configure whatever properties I wish in assistive properties. Okay, sorry, native class. So whatever properties I want, I can put it in my associative properties. Okay. So how exactly QTP learns during recording? So while learning it, how exactly what process it uses? So QTP always learns all configured mandatory properties. QTP then evaluates whether this learner description or mean to say whatever the description, whatever the properties there in mandatory, it will form the description and it will try to find the object uniquely. Right? If the learner description is not enough for an object, then it adds configured associative properties one by one to the learner description in order to uniquely identify the object. Okay, so it will add one by one, right? So there are two things can happen. For example, for some of the object class, you might have observed that, for example, there are for some controls even if it is not configured, right, then at that time what it will do, it will go to ordinal identifier. Okay, or else if whatever the properties you configured here with these associative including with mandatory properties, if it is not able to identify the object including associative properties, then it will dependent on ordinal identifier. Okay. So as a final step, it then adds an ordinal identifier such as location, index, or creation time. So creation time is only displayed for web environment. You can see here you have the three different ordinal identifier. Okay. Creation time is nothing but an like whenever you open a new QTP session, right, then it will add an kind of an index. Okay, it starts with 0 1 like that. For the first instance, for the first I instance, it will have a creation time of 0. For the second open I instance, it is of value 1 like that. Okay, the object that QTP creates with the above description is called test object. What I'm trying to say here is in the object identification, it creates and stores in object repository, right? So this is called test object and is stored in a object repository including with its object hierarchy. And how QTP exactly identifies the object during the run session? So I think we have created this one, right? So let's see how exactly it identifies during run session. Okay, when I run this session, what it will do is it will first see this dialog. Okay, it will go to object repository and finds the dialog box with login name. So it finds this login object. Okay, whatever the properties it config, like this is the learner description, right? With this learner description, it finds the exact object match that is displayed in the application. Okay, so here you can see with this learner description, it will find the exact match. Okay, so when I got that object, whatever the operation associated with that object, it performs that operation in the application. Okay, so when I say execute, it first activated this. After that, it goes to the next statement where it first identifies the login dialog box, and after that it goes to agent name. So this is the learner description. With this learner description, it tries to find the exact match in the application. Okay, when I click on it, see, did you guys see this? It entered whatever the name existing in here. So this is the operation it performed once it finds this object. In the same way, it will enter the password here and clicks on the OK button. Right? Did you guys see this? Slight reservation came up. You can see the execution in results. We just clicked on activated this. After that, entered the username as Udayanam, entered the password, and just clicked on OK button. Okay. So during run session, QTP tries to find the object with exact description match. Whatever the test object description, it finds that the exact match that is displayed in the application. The looped and actual object in the application is called runtime object. So whatever the object that is you are seeing here in the application, these objects are called runtime object, whereas the objects that are displayed in this object repository are called test objects. As long as the object is not changed, then it can identify the object and perform the action specified with the object. If the object got changed in the application, then if QTP cannot find the object with the learner description, then QTP throws an exception considering the smart identification is not enabled. So what I'm trying to say here is, for example, say if the OK button got changed to login, okay, and whatever the learn with the learner description, if it not able to find in this object, then QTP says was I am not able to find the OK button because this got changed to login button, right? Then at that time it throws an exception and the script will fail that point. That's a general thing. So whatever the process which I explained so far is called test object model. Test object is nothing but the object that is getting stored. That is what the QTP creates, and the runtime object is the actual object that is displayed in the application. The identification property set for each test object is created and maintained by QTP. So these the object configuration or what are the properties that is displayed in object identification is maintained by QTP, whereas the actual object properties, what are the properties and methods associated with this can be maintained by the object creator. At this for this example, it can be Windows. If you open a IE browser, then the object properties and methods are maintained by the Microsoft IE. Okay, QTP recognizes the operation you performed as applicable to the test object. So what I'm trying to say here is, for example, if I entered username here, it can able to identify what operation that we perform, right? As you can see, it uses the set operation, right? It didn't like perform it, like it didn't put click or something here. Whatever the operation you perform, it can generate a script with the same operation, so it can able to identify the operation that you perform. So the next property, we can retrieve or dynamically set any property values of a test object using getOverload. So what I'm trying to say here is, we so far we have used object identity, we manually configured these properties, right? Rather, we can configure these properties through script using set TO property, or you can use the get TO property. Okay, we can use these two for test objects, whereas you can use the get RO property to retrieve the runtime object properties. Whereas you here you don't see set RO property because we are not maintaining any objects. QTP is not maintaining any object. These are maintained by the object creators. Okay, we can access the internal operations or properties of a runtime object using the object property. So if you, for this control, if there are some other external properties or method associated with that object, then we can use the object method. So what I am trying to say here is, for example, see, for this minedit, if there are some other internal properties configured, then we can access those internal properties by saying winObject dot object dot whatever the property or method associated with that object. Okay, any changes you make in the object identification dialog box have no effect on the objects already added to the repository. For example, say I have created test1 to test5, okay, with some object identification. Okay, from text before recording text 6, I changed the object identification. Okay, so whatever the script, whatever the new configuration which I set in test 6 has no impact on the previously recorded test. Okay, you cannot include the same property in both the mandatory and assistive properties. So what I am trying to say here is, you cannot use the same property. For example, the text property is there in mandatory, you cannot assign, you cannot use the same text property in assistive properties. So the reason previously also I get some warning messages here. Okay, so you can also add property names to the set of available properties using the attribute. So what I am trying to say here is, it lists some of the properties with that object class. If you want to add new properties, you can just click on new button and add add that property name like identifiable or something like that. Okay, in the same way, you can for the web kind of environment, you can use a syntax like attributes slash property name, say abc or whatever the property name you wish, you can add this format. Okay, ordinal identify values are relative values and is accurate only in relation to the object in the. So what I am trying to say here is, for example, if there are three OK buttons and if we replace these two buttons, right, then at that time it will throw an error because these ordinal identifier values are relative with the neighboring objects. Okay, and the next one, QTP uses the identifier during runtime only when learning description and smart identification mechanisms are not sufficient to identify the object. So what I am trying to say here is, QTP first uses this mandatory and assistive properties and smart identification mechanism to identify. For example, for this object class, if smart identification is enabled, then it uses mandatory and assistive properties and smart identification to identify the object rather than going to the ordinal identification. If it is not able to identify with these three mandatory properties, assistive properties and smart identification, then it will go for ordinal identifier. Okay, that's all about in this video. I will be covering the smart identification in my next video. Okay, thanks for watching. Leave your comments about the content of this video. Thank you.